Hey readers, it's cozy mystery author Meg Muldoon here, and I want to welcome you to the fifth episode of my Cozy Happy Hour. Thank you so much for being here with me today, and happy Friday, happy May. Here we are in May, it's crazy. And I thought that for today and for the next Cozy Happy Hour, since it's May and since Mother's Day is coming up, I thought it would be really fun to read, to actually read out loud one of my novellas. So I have a novella called Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery, which I wrote about 2 years ago, I think, and it's a Mother's Day novella mystery, so I thought it would be perfect timing. And so this particular mystery can be found in the collection of other novellas that are based on the Christmas River series called Caught in Christmas River. And so this is available on Amazon if you want to read along today with this story. But this particular novella is actually one of my very favorites. I think favorite things I've ever written. I think ever. It's really fun because it's written in third person, which I rarely do. Most of my books are written in first person from Cinnamon's perspective, but for this one, it's actually with Warren, Cinnamon's grandfather, as the main character and as kind of the main person solving the crime here that takes place. And it's just a really nostalgic. It takes place in 1951, and it's a very kind of nostalgic read, and it's just perfect for this time of year. So I thought it would be just a really fun opportunity here to read it for you guys. So I'll read part one today, and then next week I'll continue with it. So without further ado, I guess I'll start here. So here we are, Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery. Chapter 1. Warren Peters placed the two bouquets of freshly picked wildflowers on the passenger seat next to him. He put the keys in the ignition, and the engine turned over. The old green Chevy coughed and rumbled, the way it always did after a cold night. Warren pulled out of the parking spot in front of the house and headed down Main Street, stopping several times for packs of tourists as they sluggishly strolled along the crosswalks. The old man headed west, following the street until it eventually widened and began climbing. The quaint buildings of downtown Christmas River dropped away, replaced with towering spruce and juniper trees that cast long shadows across the road. After a couple of miles, he passed the large wooden sign, the one that had stood there for as long as his memory went back. It read, Christmas River Highway, now open. Warren unrolled the window. Fresh mountain air tinged with the dampness of melting snow filled the cab of the truck, and he took in a deep, greedy breath. The bright sun felt good as it warmed his ancient shoulders. The smell of that mountain air in May never got old, neither did the feeling of this highway beneath the truck's wheels. Even though Warren had first started coming up to these lakes over 7 decades earlier, spring in the mountains always was and always would be a magical thing to him. Warren drifted along the highway, passing lakes that sparkled in deep shades of emerald and sapphire under the clear spring sky. After a few winding switchbacks, Warren finally saw it. He slowed down a little as he approached, gazing at the small, decrepit shack. Its roof had more or less caved in, the front door was missing, and it seemed like even the smallest breeze might cause the whole structure to collapse. But the sign was still there, even after all these years, having survived yet another brutal winter. Sparks Lake General Store, established 1946, for all your fishing needs and more. Warren felt the corners of his mouth turn up slightly as he passed by. Seeing that old shack always made him a little sad, but a little happy too. Chapter 2, May 1951. Etta Peters came out of the kitchen dressed in her Sunday best, carrying the silver platter between her arms with pride. Like every Sunday, the platter was loaded with corned beef, roasted potatoes, and big slabs of homemade cheese bread, the smells of which had been tortuously lingering in the Peters household all day long. The silver platter was a family heirloom that Warren's grandmother had brought with her on the boat from Ireland. Warren's mother said that the platter dated back generations in her family, and she treated it with reverence, only bringing it out for Sundays and special occasions. Warren's family wasn't rich, meaning they usually ate the same as most of the other middle-class families in Christmas River, but Etta made sure to save a little money each week to eat a good, proper meal on Sundays. There would always be a roast on the table, potatoes, and billowy braided bread made with fresh Tillamook cheese that took her all day to make. Etta believed deeply in the sanctity of Sunday and that it was a time for the Spirit and for peace to reign over the household. But while Warren's mother believed in the holiness of Sunday, others at the table often didn't respect the day as much as Warren knew she would have liked, or as much as Warren would have liked for that matter. "Do you have something to say for yourself, young man?" Warren's father, Martin Peters, said, picking up a bread knife and grimly slathering fresh butter on a fat slice of the cheese bread. Warren had been supremely enjoying the bread himself, but he felt its fine flavor turn to ash in his mouth at his father's stern words. Warren gulped hard. "Well, I don't know, sir," the teenager finally said. "Is there something I ought to be sorry for?" Warren knew by the harsh flicker in his father's eyes that what lay ahead wouldn't be any fun. Whenever Warren had done something to his father's disliking, the man would rarely come out right and say what his son had done. He'd usually let Warren sweat a little before he revealed what the transgression was. It wasn't that he didn't get along with his father, but Warren was 17 now, taller than Martin, and opposite to him in many ways. Martin Peters was a hard worker right down to his bones. Every morning he'd get up earlier than he had to and go to Clayton Mill, the place where he worked. He'd always come home later than he had to also. Martin had been through the Depression, and he liked to tell Warren that having a job wasn't guaranteed, so you had to fight to keep in good standing with the company you worked for. On the other hand, Warren, while not necessarily a loaf about, he did have a job after school at the Sparks Lake General Store. Wasn't exactly what most people would call a hard worker. Warren liked to fish in his free time. He liked sitting by the lakes with his buddies Larry, Quail, and Sully, drinking beer, talking about fishing and all the things they would do after they graduated from Christmas River High. Martin Peters set down the piece of bread he'd been buttering. He stared hard at his only son. "Your mother and I ran into Mr. Stanley at the grocery today," Martin said. "He tells us that you're failing English. He says hardly has he ever seen a student who applies himself so little." Warren felt his cheeks burn red. The huge appetite he'd had after smelling the aroma of stewing meat and fresh bread baking all day completely vanished. He couldn't deny what the English teacher had told his parents. Warren had all but given up on getting a good grade in Mr. Stanley's class. Not only had it been hard to concentrate with Mr. Stanley droning on about Whitman and Emerson, but there was something else about English class that Warren had found distracting. Her name was May Reed, and she was just about the prettiest girl that Warren had ever set eyes on. He knew he should have been applying himself the way Mr. Stanley told him to, but instead Warren found himself stealing glances during class at her, hoping that one day she'd notice him. "Martin," Etta Peters said in a low voice, "perhaps now is not the time for this conversation. Let's sit down in the living room after dinner and—" "No, Etta, it needs to be spoken about now. This is serious business. Our son's work ethic is deplorable." Martin looked across the table at Warren. "You're lucky to live in a country where hard work means something, son, where you can change your situation by applying yourself. But here you are wasting the good opportunity that God gave you." "Martin," Warren's mother rasped as she nervously played with the locket around her neck, "let's just enjoy our meal, and if he doesn't learn the value of hard work now, then he's never going to learn." Martin's voice had taken on a sullen, disappointed tone that made Warren's stomach ache. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll apply myself from now on," Warren said quietly. But the answer didn't appear to be good enough. Martin shook his head, looking out the front windows of the small house. "Words don't mean anything if there's no action to back them up, Warren. We all know you're good at talking, but I don't know if you have what it takes for real change." By nature, Warren didn't have much of a temper. But something about the way his father said that, something about the way his father had to have the last word, nearly made young Warren blow his top. Warren tried to stay in his seat, but before he knew what was happening, he was leaving the dinner table, heading for his station wagon outside. Warren flicked his wrist. Chapter 3. Warren flicked his wrist and sent the line flying over the glistening waters of Sparks Lake. After several long moments, the sinker landed with a plopping sound a good distance away. The line bulged in a light breeze blowing off Charity Peak, reminding Warren of a long, delicate thread in a spider's web. The air was getting chilly as the sun sank closer to the tree line on the horizon. The highway had opened early this year on account of favorable spring weather, but in the depths of the forest there were still patches of melting snow. The ground, too, was damp and cold. Warren hadn't had time to grab his coat on his way out, but there was no way he was going back to his house. He'd spend the night camping out on the banks of the lake in freezing temperatures if he had to, or on the floor of the general store across the way. Maybe he wouldn't even go back to school. After all, his father would never be happy with Warren's grades. What was the point? Why even try? They both knew that Warren wasn't ever going to be the son that his father had hoped for. Warren might as well drop out now and go work at the mill the way he was probably going to do anyway. Warren wedged the fishing pole between a pair of rocks and grabbed the beer off the ground. Larry Quayle, Sully, and him kept a stash of cold ones beneath a log on the south shores of the lake, and he was sure the boys wouldn't mind if he dipped into the reserves. Warren cracked the bottle open and started taking a long, much-needed drink. Of course, if Warren quit school now, it would mean he'd miss out on seeing May Reed every day, and that was a sacrifice he wasn't sure if he wanted to make. Warren stared out at the lake for a long moment, dreaming of those large brown eyes of hers. May Reed wasn't exactly pretty in the way that most of the guys talked about, and on top of that, she came from one of the poorest families in Christmas River. But Warren didn't care one iota about any of that. May had a quiet beauty all her own, a kind of bookish beauty. She was always working hard in English, and judging from the proud way in which Mr. Stanley handed back exams to her, it was obvious that she was one of the best pupils in the class. Warren liked that she wasn't a braggart about her smarts. He also liked that she was always nice to everyone, even the students who said mean things behind her back about how poor her family was. May treated everyone like they mattered. Warren wished that he had the courage to talk to her. He'd tried a few times, but something had always thwarted his attempts. The most recent time it had been Philip Clayton. The senior football star had taken the seat next to May just as Warren was about to, almost as if he'd known what had been on Warren's mind and was purposefully trying to sabotage his efforts. Philip Clayton's father owned the biggest mill in Christmas River, and his family was the wealthiest one in town by a good margin. Because of the Claytons' influence, Philip was a golden boy at the high school and was starting quarterback for the football team. There were players who were better than him, but because he was a Clayton, Philip had made the team his freshman year. Warren liked to think that he could get along with just about anybody, but Philip Clayton wasn't easy to get along with. Warren knew his parents would frown on such language, but there was no getting around it. Philip was a fathead. Proud, arrogant, and self-entitled, and now that he had his eyes fixed on May, Warren disliked him even more. Warren felt his forehead wrinkle as something across the lake caught his eye. At first he thought it might be a deer. It was spring after all, and the foothills and mountains of Central Oregon were crowded with them in spring. But as Warren focused his eyes, he made out the lean figure of a man in the woods across the lake, standing in the shadows of the pines. Warren couldn't see a face, but he could see the man's silhouette. He could also see that he was carrying a rifle of some sort. Warren wasn't sure, but he thought it might be Leroy Reed, standing there. Up until the week before, Leroy was one of Warren's co-workers at the Sparks Lake General Store, and coincidentally, he was also May Reed's older brother. Warren was just about to wave and call across the lake when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "I thought I might find you here, Wren." Warren felt his blood run cold. Only one person in the world called him Wren, and he knew she wouldn't be too happy about the cold beer in his hand, especially with it being Sunday. Warren turned around to see his mother standing there, still in her Sunday clothes. She held a large wooden basket in one hand and Warren's well-loved plaid Pendleton coat in the other. Her eyes drifted down to the beer bottle in his hand, but to Warren's surprise, there was no look of disappointment or judgment on her face. She handed him the jacket. "Your father only says those things because he loves you, you know." Warren felt his face fall into a sour expression. "No, I think he says those things because he enjoys putting me down mostly." "Oh, pish-posh," she said, putting a hand on her hip. "He does not." Warren let out a groan. His mother was always saying that stupid phrase, pish-posh this, pish-posh that, and every time she said it, it embarrassed Warren to no end, especially when she said it out in public. That was the worst. "Ma, I thought we talked about this. You're not supposed to say that word anymore. Ain't even a word." "Neither is ain't, but I don't correct you about it," she said. "Anyway, your father's just worried. He wants a good life for his son. You don't remember what it was like back in the 30s. Those times have a way of haunting a person like your father." His mother stared out across the lake, letting out an uneasy sigh. It wasn't entirely true. Warren did remember what it was like in those years. He was young, but Warren had a memory like an elephant. He remembered his father's grim face at the dinner table. There was no corned beef and cheese bread on the table in those days. Warren also remembered the emptiness in his small belly. He remembered his father's absence for months at a time, and when Martin Peters would return, he'd look worn out and pale, sort of like the men who had come home from the war a few years back, men who had been through something that was never expressed in words. "Your father had always hoped that you would go to college," his mother continued, "that you would become a lawyer one day, or a politician maybe, somebody who has a say in what happens." Warren scoffed. "If Dad thinks I'm going to be a politician, he doesn't know the first thing about me." His mother handed him the basket. There was a large hunk of the cheese bread along with some butter and a knife. "I didn't want you to go hungry," she said. Warren smiled, looking over at Etta. She always seemed to understand him much better than his father. The two of them were cut more or less from the same cloth. Etta was a hard worker, but like her son, she seemed to also understand that there was more to life than work. "The trout biting?" she said, holding a hand up to her forehead, shielding her eyes from the lowering sun. "Not yet." "They will. You using the night crawlers like I taught you?" Warren nodded. Though nobody else outside the Peters family knew, Warren's mom had been the one to teach her son how to fish. With Martin Peters being gone so much in those early years for work, Etta had had to step in and teach her son important things like fishing and how to build a fire in the woods without matches. "Say, what are you getting me for Mother's Day?" she asked with a smile. Warren's mom always did this. Weeks before the actual day, she'd be asking him what he was going to get her. "Night crawlers," he said flatly. His mother let out a good-natured laugh. Then, to Warren's shock, she reached over and grabbed the bottle of beer from his hands. She took a swig, then handed it back. Etta winked at her son. "Don't stay out here too long, Wren," she said. "It'll be getting cold tonight, and I've got a lemon buttermilk pie on the kitchen table. And if that doesn't bring you home, then I don't know what will." With that, Etta Peters walked away through the trees back to the car. Chapter 4. "Do you mind if I have a Coca-Cola, Pete?" Pete Driggs, the younger of the two brothers who owned the Sparks Lake General Store, glanced up from his ash-dusted newspaper. Pete usually sat in the corner of the store most afternoons, smoking cigarette after cigarette, reading the paper while flattening down his mustache absent-mindedly. He was tall and lean, and only about 5 years older than Warren, which was probably why they got along so well. Pete was also fun to be around, which was probably the other reason why they got along so well. He had a natural charisma that just about everybody in town was drawn to. "Help yourself, son. My brother would want me to tell you that it'll have to come out of your pay this week, but I won't tell if you won't." "Thanks a bunch, Pete." Warren went over to the icebox. He came back and cracked the bottle open with the general store's church key. It was a slow afternoon, with the fishing season only just getting started at the lake. But Warren knew that with school getting out soon and the return of warmer weather, the general store would soon be a madhouse. For the moment, though, it was as sluggish as a garden snake on a cold morning, and Warren felt glad that Pete was there to pass the hours with. Clyde Driggs, Pete's older brother and the one who hired Warren the year before, was in his office in the back like usual, running numbers and making up lists of inventory. When he did show his face out front, Clyde Driggs usually didn't have a whole lot to say. He was about 10 years older than Pete, and opposite to him in nearly every way. Clyde was almost as stern as Warren's own father, and seemingly incapable of smiling. He was recently married to a very nice lady named Ada. Warren would have thought the change in his marital status would have lightened Clyde's mood some, but nothing had changed since the wedding last fall. If anything, Clyde Driggs seemed to be even more ornery and troubled than before. Warren was glad that the big man stayed back in his office most of the time. "Slow day," Warren commented, looking out the store's front windows. "That it is," Pete said, flipping the pages of the newspaper. "But don't worry, things will be hopping around here soon enough. It's going to be a busy summer. I can feel it in my bones." Pete was superstitious and often talked about feeling things in his bones. Warren never quite understood what he meant, but he always pretended like he did. "That'll be better than waiting all afternoon like now," Warren said. Don't let my brother hear that, Pete said. He'll cut your hours and you won't be able to take that pretty girl of yours out on dates anymore. Warren felt his cheeks burn. Pete had been the only one he'd ever told about his love for May Reed. He hadn't even ventured to tell Larry about it because his best friend couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. Larry blabbed to his girl Sheila about everything. For the 100th time, she's not my girlfriend, Pete, Warren said. I mean, not yet, anyway. Pete smiled, seemingly pleased at getting Warren all flustered. I'm just busting your chops, kid. But what's the holdup? You scared of asking a girl a simple question? No, Warren said. I just... Pete sat forward in his chair, letting loose a long puff of smoke. Listen, kid, you wait too long, somebody else is going to take her. That's the way it works. If you like her, just ask her out. Easy as pie. She says yes, great. She says no, then you're free to move on to another one. And believe me, kid, there's always another one. That was easy for Pete to say, Warren thought. He was a regular Romeo, seemingly always dating a new girl each week. I don't know why it's so hard, Warren mumbled. It gets easier, Pete said, smiling a smile that Warren's mother might call devilish. It's all about confidence, kid. Just then the front door to the shop opened. Warren shot up out of the stool he'd been sitting on like the seat had turned to hot coals. It was Leroy Reed, May's older brother and the former general store morning attendant. Warren just hoped he hadn't heard any of the conversation about his sister. Leroy wasn't a hothead or anything, but still, Warren didn't want to get on his bad side. There was something about Leroy that you didn't want to cross. He hadn't always been like that. Some people even said that he used to be fun-loving, but after he came back from the war, he'd changed. He was quiet and kept to himself these days, and people didn't know how to act around him anymore. Oh, hi there, Leroy, Warren stammered. Leroy stepped into the store slowly, the limp in his right leg only noticeable because Warren knew about it. Leroy had been wounded in Okinawa. He'd returned with a purple heart and a bum leg and would never work the same. Over the years, Leroy had done a good job covering up the limp, but it came at the price of always having to move slowly. Hi, Warren, Leroy said in a low voice. Is Mr. Driggs in? Both Warren and Leroy knew that he was talking about the older brother, Clyde Driggs, but Pete stood up like he was talking to him. I'm here, Pete said. Clyde's busy in his office at the moment. Leroy, as if not hearing Pete, walked past them, marching directly into Clyde's office without even knocking. A moment later, the office door slammed shut behind him. Pete shook his head, clicking his tongue against the roof of his mouth. I must have told him 1,000 times. You need anything, all you have to do is ask and we'll help you out. Instead, he tries to steal from us. What choice did we have? Warren looked down at the ground. He hadn't been working when it happened, but the week before, Leroy had been caught stealing some canned tuna and a loaf of bread from the store. The brothers had fired him on the spot. Warren felt bad for him. Everyone in town knew about the Reed family situation. The mother had passed on while Leroy was away in the South Pacific, and their father was bedridden after a hard bout with polio some years before. Leroy took care of the younger siblings, and everyone knew that the family was poorer than the dry ground of the eastern Oregon desert. Occasionally, the Catholic church Warren's family attended had even taken up collections for the family. Warren supposed that their situation must have gotten so bad that Leroy had been forced to steal. And even though Warren knew stealing was wrong, he sometimes wondered if all thieves could be judged the same. Pete sat back down in his chair and opened up the paper again. Leroy had closed the door behind him, but the walls were thin, and Warren did his best not to eavesdrop. Warren took a sip of his Coca-Cola, trying to focus on something else. That's when he caught sight of the car sitting out in the parking lot. He walked over to the window facing the parking spaces in the lake. It suddenly felt as though somebody had reached inside his chest and ripped his heart out. There she was, May Reed, the girl he was secretly in love with, looking pretty as ever, sitting in the front seat of a brand-new hardtop convertible. A brand-new hardtop convertible that belonged to none other than fathead Philip Clayton. Philip sat next to her, grinning and laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. Warren just stood there at the window, feeling like a gut-shot outlaw. He'd never known a feeling like this, and the sheer pain of the moment overwhelmed him. How could she go for him? For a chump like that? He was rich, all right, but that was about where his good qualities ended. Warren closed his eyes for a second and shook his head. Pete's words from earlier echoing in his ears. He'd waited too long, and now he'd lost the one girl that he'd ever loved, probably forever. Because it's not right, Mr. Driggs. Leroy's raised voice echoed from behind the closed door of the office, distracting Warren from the pain. I've tried to be civil to you, Leroy. I could have reported this to the police. Instead, I decided to show some mercy considering your family situation. But if you come back here again, then I won't hesitate to get Sheriff Coe himself out here. You understand? Warren shot a glance back at Pete. He had his nose buried in his newspaper, acting as if he couldn't hear the shouting. A second later, the door to Clyde Driggs's office opened. Leroy came out, walking fast, his limp worsening with the speed. Leroy brushed past Warren, opened the front door, then slammed it back behind him so hard Warren was afraid the glass windows might break from the impact. Warren watched as Leroy made his way down the steps, getting into Philip Clayton's hardtop convertible. A moment later, the car was backing up and squealing out of the dirt lot. We don't tolerate thieves, Clyde Driggs said, stepping out from the office, angry and red in the face. Well said, brother, Pete said in agreement, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. All right, so next week we will continue with this story, which is Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery. And I just want to thank you so much for joining me here. And we'll follow up and see what happens with Warren and the Driggs brothers, and of course Leroy too. So thank you, and I'll see you next week for my Cozy Happy Hour. See you guys. Bye.